Good afternoon, everyone. So we're just going to jump right in, if that's okay with you, because we like to leave some time at the end for some of your questions. So I'd like to start off with Bradford. Why should you think we should focus on adversity?
So that's a broad question, but here's what, and I'll just speak to it from my context. I think of adversity and actually the topic, failure, adaptability, and success. I kind of think of it all as challenge. And what is the value of challenge? And there's a lot that can be discussed, but I think one of the interesting things right now is challenge and adversity is a great teacher and a great revealer of who you are. And for my brother and I, with our eye condition, that has actually served us quite well because the challenge and adversity teaches you a number of very, very important skills. One of the things that we tell some of the families that contact us after they've had a child diagnosed with one of these retinal eye diseases is we're so lucky to live with so much technology and resources. Don't let this challenge become a psychological one. And so, if you can approach challenge in a healthy way and embrace it, I think it'll teach you your strengths and your weaknesses. It'll teach you how to face rejection. The journey of that is almost more valuable than the result or the success of it.
Warner, would you like to expand?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the next question is, what are some of the obstacles that you face on your journey to valuing adversity and failure as an opportunity for success?
Sorry, can you say the beginning one more
so
time?
what were some of the obstacles that you faced on your journey to valuing adversity and failure as an opportunity for success?
Kind of what I was saying earlier, I think a lot of the obstacles that I faced were when I was younger, because when we were first diagnosed, that is when you're in this kind of state of confusion. It was the first time that I felt different. When in first grade I needed to stand at the chalkboard to see what was on the board. But all these, I think probably what is consistent about a lot of the challenges that Brian, my brother, and I have faced is you're put into a lot of awkward situations. You're getting into an Uber that's somebody else's because you can't read the license plate. You're walking into a women's restroom instead of a men's restroom because you can't see the stick figure dress. And I think one of those obstacles taught us how to be lighthearted, how you frame your personal how you frame the situation is actually how you'll teach others to frame it. If I laugh off a moment, nobody feels sorry for you. They laugh along with you. So I think that's an example of some of the stuff that we learned.
Well, the situation I'm in reminds me of a medical student preparing for an exam. And the medical student thought the exam was going to really be on the liver. So he studied the liver up one side and down the other. But the exam turned out to be the pancreas gland and not the liver. So he starts off his answer to the question by saying, the pancreas gland is located next to the liver. So, what I have to say has nothing to do with what when I think about adversity in life and encountering things that you didn't anticipate and so forth, it all comes up to the whole concept of choice points, and that we have choices in life all the time, and whether we recognize it or not. And the consequences of those choices that we make is how we have to cope and how we deal with things that we are facing. So so we're going to talk about the liver now in terms of choice points. What I wanted to do is just to read you a quick story to get you into the frame of mind about what I'm talking about. and how you deal with things you don't anticipate. This is a book called Choice Points, of all things, by a dear and old friend of mine, Jack Lightwell, who spent his career at Peabody down at Vanderbilt, a sister institution to Teachers College. Is the Peabody College. In any case, he's been in psychology down there all of his career. And he wrote this book called Choice Points, published by MIT Press. So I'm going to read you, this is not going to be long. It's not going to hurt, but so it's just a quick story to get your head into choice points. So one Saturday, my wife and a neighbor planned a long shopping tour. I agreed to sit with a pair of 2-year-olds, our daughter, Pam, and our neighbor's son, Oscar. Oscar, like a lot of other kids in that half-square block, was a fellow who met life more than halfway. His brain was as fast as light and as sharp as a needle. His body was as tough as leather and as active as a tiger cub. He entered a room like a whirlwind. 2 minutes after entering, he handled questions asked about, and he tested the strength of every object and every person within his reach. You remember a 2-year-old?
Yeah.
We loved him and knew him well. That morning, only unbreakable objects were within his reach. His mother and she and my wife were leaving, and as they left, turned in the doorway and said, his mother said, he didn't eat any breakfast at all. Try to get him to eat some lunch. I didn't know it then, but that remark set into action a chain of choice points. I didn't recognize most of them at the time, but looking back, I have never forgotten any of them, and I've looked back at them often. Let me tell you how it went. Being a graduate student in psychology, I felt I knew a thing or two about children. In fact, I had just finished a course in child development and a lot of observations of 2-year-olds. I knew that they would play separately, mostly, and without much supervision. Sure enough, they did just that, requiring little from me. I just kept them in sight and congratulated myself on my good judgment and skill at minimum supervision. Lunchtime came. I called to them sprightly, "Who would like some lunch?" Quick as a flash, Oscar snapped back, "Not me." I had missed another choice point and I had made another mistake. I shifted my approach. "All right," I said, "I'll have some lunch. If you two want to join me, you can." Pam watched the whole thing with fascination. I was pretty good at heating up a can of soup. I knew they both liked bean soup, and soon I had a pot of soup going. And then I remembered my textbook. The thing to do was to give Oscar some positive choices. No questions could be asked or answered yes or no. With that thought, I made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. The pot of soup and the sandwiches were ready, and I asked, who wants soup and who wants sandwiches? "I don't want any lunch," Oscar was firm. "Okay," I returned with phony indifference. I sat down and began to eat. Pam joined me. Perhaps she knew how desperately I needed support. Perhaps she was just hungry. Oscar played with a toy truck. I had passed another choice point. By now, I was aware how much I was on the spot. I knew my choices had consequences. In some way I didn't understand, I knew also that the consequences went beyond food and nutrition, courage and cowardice, freedom and slavery, support and indifference. In some small way, all of them were involved. After a time, I turned to Oscar. "Don't you like bean soup?" "Sure, but not for lunch." "What would you like for lunch?" Oscar's eyes sparkled with lights of mischief. "I'd like a worm," Oscar shouted. "A worm?" He was tickled to death. "A worm." This time he shouted louder. I was well aware by now that I was in a special kind of fight. For Oscar, it was Independence Day. For me, it was examination day. My resourcefulness as an adult was being challenged. For Pam, it was loyalty day. She was supporting me, and she knew how much I needed her. "Okay," I replied, "a worm." Outside we went. I rammed the spade into the ground with rare vigor, my excitement mounting. Soon I extracted a nice, long earthworm. True story. Back into the house, a quick wash job, and the worm was on a plate before a surprised but unruffled Oscar. He said, "You didn't cook it." I moved quickly out of the plate into a frying pan with a little butter, and in no time the worm was earthworm sauté. Back on the plate, and again in front of Oscar. He looked up at me and in unbelievable innocence said, "Cut it up." I moved even more quickly and I cut the worm into 2 pieces. "Eat. You eat with me." At a time like that, at a choice point like that, even knowing my own foolishness, I could not go down in defeat. In my anger and tension, I felt sure I had one alternative: deceit. I picked up half the worm, pretended to eat it, and palmed it into my pocket. I did the trick pretty well. Oscar's eyes were on my mouth, pretending to chew. He never looked at my pocket. As I finished my chewing, Oscar's face clouded over. His mouth turned down and he began to cry. In between his sobs, he struck the last blow. "You ate my half." That was the end of the battle, but it will never leave my memory. For me, that lunch with Pam and Oscar summed up all the dimensions of all the changes of bungled choice points that have cropped up in and around my emotional problems of living with people. They seem simple to summarize: when to fight and when to run away, and how to fight and how to run away, and when to be dependent and when to be dependable, and how to be dependent and how to be dependable, when to offer love and when to seek love, and how to offer love and how to seek love. The choice point for me that it was the most significant in my life was when I blew the whistle on my boss. And I paid the price for that. So that's a long story, but I'll try to shorten it a good bit, and then we can see what you do when you have choices like this. Talk about the consequences of blowing one's whistle. I was in an organization that was at the time a part of the NEA, National Education Association, in Washington, D.C. This was the National Training Laboratories, which was a department in the Adult Education Division of NEA. And you may not know this, but the National Training Laboratories was the organization that founded and sponsored for many, many years the so-called T group, or sensitivity training, or the encounter group. And I was a part of all that for 8 years. And I loved the organization and loved what we did and was really strongly committed to it. And it was the one time in my life, people who are the important people in Teachers College maybe are not here right now, so I can say what the hell I want. And that is, Suzanne doesn't count. She's my friend. It was the only time in my life and career with an organization where the goals and the mission of the organization were the same as my own. In other words, there was no difference, there was no conflict between the mission of the organization and my career mission, my mission in life, and so on and so forth. And that's important to think about in terms of the choices then you make as a consequence of that choice. And so my mentor, Lee Bradford, who was the president of that organization, had just retired. And I was asked would I take his place as the head of the organization, and I said, I don't really think I'm ready. And that was truthful. But I agreed to be number 2. And the number 1 guy was kind of a dark horse in the race, and so he took over as president. We'll get to the point. After about a year of his reign as the head of the organization, we were in trouble. And a big lawsuit facing us, and a number of other kinds of things. And I was contacted by one of the board members. Could he come and spend a couple of hours with me and talk to me about what's going on? And so I met him in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. In fact, I can tell you we're in the lobby right now. We met, and this was 50 years ago or something like that. His name was Chris Argers, by the way, a name that's big in our field. And so he came and met with me for a couple of hours in the lobby and asked me 1,000 questions. And I leveled with him and told him I thought we were in trouble. So what he said was, I'm going to call an emergency board meeting, and you must come to that board meeting and you must tell the board what you just told me. How's that for being a big mouth? Choice point on my part, right? That's a big deal. So I go back and I talk to my staff, and they say, oh yeah, you got to do it. We'll be there behind you. We'll support it. And all, but you got to do it. Nobody else can do it, but you got to go and tell the board that the president is failing. And so that meeting did occur at the New York Athletic Club. It's down the street from here. I can show you the room and everything about it. And I did spill my beans on the table to the board about it. And as a consequence of all that, to get to the point, the board voted about whether or not the president should stay, and it was split down the middle, which meant he would stay. And 2 weeks later, what happened to me? He comes into my office and does what? Fires me. So there I am on the street and have lost the organization that I loved. And how do you face that kinds of thing? And that's another story, but I don't have enough time. But let me just say this. When you face a situation like that, which I would call an adversity in life, that's for sure, you need to think through what the consequences are of what the act is that you will do. And my assumption was I would have the support that I needed. Guess what? I didn't have any support, except from the board. My staff were there physically, and that was it. So if you are faced with such a situation, be clear about the fact that you will be probably inevitably alone. And if you're not willing to deal with the consequences of being alone, don't do it. But if you feel strongly enough to do it, and would I do it again? Yes, I would. Did I pay a price? Yes. I was in the desert for 2 years, trying to find my way to the next part of my career. So a big price. Anyway, the liver is next to the pancreas gland.
That's great.
Thank you. So the next question is, how do you cultivate stamina when dealing with experiences of failure? So you kind of mentioned you didn't have enough time to talk about it, but it kind of relates back to what you were just saying of like kind of how you were able to kind of make it through that time in the desert, as you put it. Can you expand a little bit about how you were able, what were some of the resources, what were some of the things that you did to kind of maintain you until you found what you were looking for?
It was 2 years where I was on my own, and I was a freelance consultant, so to speak, and had to learn how to make a living doing those kind of things. So what I did was, number one, do a lot of work that I was not really paid adequately to do. But I was married and had a baby girl, so there were obligations that had to be met. The other thing is to do a lot of reflection and self-examination. And by the way, that's not easy work. Maybe easy for you, it's not for me. Although I do it a lot because I believe so strongly in it. That is the reflection part, and examining what were my strengths, what were my limitations, and so forth. And then to do something about the kind of limitations that I thought I had. And so I discovered some of those things during that 2 years and ended up going through a professional development program at the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland. And got myself trained as a Gestalt therapist because I found that would help me to determine some of the things in my professional life that I were missing. And so, for example, quick example, and I'll shut up. But the example is, I was trained as a social psychologist, therefore I knew groups and interpersonal relations up one side and down the other. I could do team building in my sleep. But what we do today that we call coaching, I was not particularly skillful at. So that's when I went and got myself trained as a therapist, because we didn't have coaching programs then. This is in the 70s. This is before you called it coaching. we call it counseling or something like that. Coaching was not even mentioned. Coaching was in sports. That's no longer true, is it? So I didn't have the choices that are available today, so that's why I chose therapy. And it was a good choice. I could use the therapy as well as get some skills that I didn't have. And that spent 13 months going through that, kind of intense. And I have all kinds of stories about that, like losing sleep. So anyway, finding out through a reflective process what it is you need to work on. But focus on yourself and not assume that you have been a victim. I was not a victim. I made the choice of blowing the whistle. That's not being victimized. So I made that choice, and what were the consequences of that I had to think through? And that's the main thing to bear in mind, is what would be the consequences.
Bradford?
You know, it's similar to that in some ways. And the question is, you know, when you do face failure or adversity, sort of how do you bounce back from it, or what do you do in that circumstance? I'm reminded of a couple stories, but I think the big lesson for me on this particular question is, do not attribute that specific moment or failure to some greater identifier of who you are. Somebody will go through a very tough moment and think that there's something wrong with themselves. You know, I'm thinking of a story of one of my best friends in college whose mother passed away from brain cancer during school. And he's a really, really fun guy, a great guy. And sort of 6 months, you know, after his mom passed away, he was telling me about this kind of breakthrough he had. He was seeing a therapist, and, you know, he was telling the therapist, I don't like going out with my friends anymore. I don't find the same things funny anymore. You know, I'm sad and you know, I feel weird. And the psychologist, through, you know, whatever means, basically conveyed to him, it's called grief. This is a period of grief. You know, take it easy on yourself. You know, adjustment, failures, challenges, they're called those things for a reason. And I think one of the things that's been very healthy for me is when you do face those particular situations. If we have everything from a big challenge to having a really rough week, you know, working on this business with my brother, you know, it's okay to take a pause and say, it was a tough week. Let's do some things that rejuvenate and refresh us, and not pass sweeping judgments about ourselves for that particular moment.
The next question, in what ways would you argue adversity enhances creativity, learning, innovation, and progress?
It doesn't enhance the creativity unless you do something different. So you can't just be passive about it. You've got to take some kind of active steps. It's called learning agility, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say.
That sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
But if you know, passivity is the antithesis of agility. So to be passive about what you do is the death knell. So you got to do something, even though you don't know what it is you necessarily need to do. But doing something that you can learn from and get information about quickly and act on it is the important step to take, the kind of step to take.
You know, was that?
What would you add to that?
Not much, but I would just say I think adversity and challenges create more and more self-awareness, and I think in that you can uncover some of your own creativity.
By the way, the term he used, self-awareness, there's a ton of research that says that there's a strong relationship between self-awareness and effectiveness of leadership. In other words, effective leaders are very self-aware. And I can now go into a list of examples of people who are not, and give you some fodder to feed on in terms of who does not fit that. But I'm not going to do that. I could get sued, couldn't I?
So the next question is, how do you model the value of adversity or failure in your practice?
You want that one first, or? You know, I think there's an important point here too, that we come from a framework of you should embrace challenge, you should lean into it, and from that challenge there's going to be an outcome. You're going to be successful or you're going to fail, but the step of being active in approaching that challenge, in a lot of ways you've already won. I think there's an important caveat. You can't just cut your arm off to challenge yourself. So I think you have to put some guardrails on it. But the idea that you become somebody who will challenge yourself for the challenge's sake, I think is such a powerful idea, because we believe that you just get better. You get better. You think about that piece of coal that's under all that pressure. That's where the diamond comes from. And I really believe in the same way. You can't learn about yourself if you're not on the field, being active and challenging yourself.
The last question that I have before I kind of give it out to the audience, so if you have any questions, prepare yourself. If you could provide one piece of advice to the audience on the topic of adversity, failure, and adaptivity, what would that be exactly?
Well, I went first last time. So.
Adversity does not necessarily mean taking turns. To say it again, the death knell is passivity. Is to do something, even though you don't know quite what to do. You're puzzled about it, but to be somewhat active. Not that you're risking getting your arm cut off, as you said. It doesn't have to be that big of a deal, but some action that you take that you can get some feedback on. And if you don't go into that kind of process, you're not going to get anywhere. And by the way, the other thing that I would emphasize is not spend all your time by yourself. It's hard to get feedback on yourself by yourself. And sitting down with somebody that's a trusted friend is just invaluable in terms of being able to bounce things off somebody that you trust and get some thoughts about it that you hadn't thought about, because inevitably that will occur. You haven't thought of everything. Now, I am really, really plenty smart, let me tell you. I can't think of everything. I don't know if that blows your mind or not, but I just can't. You know what I mean, I'm sure.
I feel like I'm living this unique situation right now where our project, Two Blind Brothers, that's given so much to my brother and I in terms of purpose and fun and adventure and chances to do things like this. It was our greatest challenge, this vision impairment growing up, and now it's given us our greatest gift. And it's taught us. It's been such an incredible teacher. When I had to, if I ever had to stand up in front of a classroom because I couldn't see the board, or I had to embarrass myself, like walking into that bathroom example I mentioned. It arms you with these psychological tools and the skills, and if not for a lot of those challenges, we all need our own path to mastery. We all need that thing that teaches us and reveals sort of who we are. If you don't have it, then you are really losing out. So I feel like, as a piece of advice, when you see those opportunities to embrace challenge and you're weighing those options, consider that perhaps that challenge in itself, regardless of outcome, is valuable to you.
Now I'd like to turn it over to the audience if you have any questions. Give you a minute.
Warren, you mentioned learning agility, and
I just mentioned
you just
it.
mentioned it because I know that you've written a couple of books on it and done some research, but you mentioned reflection being so important in relation to learning agility and leadership. Any other aspect of learning agility that we might all think about as we think through this topic of adversity and success, and growing, learning?
Thank you, Susan. That's a very nice setup you just provided.
David sent it over.
The two main factors of it all is speed and flexibility. So, that, in other words, that's what the research tends to show. There's 9 different dimensions, but those are the two major ones in terms of outcomes you want to experience. I want to be more flexible, and I want to be able to come up to speed fast in terms of trying to find out what to do here. So that's why I emphasize as much as I do the active part rather than being passive. So by being active, that's going to generate something quickly that you can learn from. As to that was a stupid idea, you know, and that's fine, you know, and that's another factor here that's really, really important. Is if you're going to be fearful all of your life about making mistakes, you got a real problem. So mistakes is a way of life, and just don't make big ones. You know, you know, like don't get married to the first person. Never mind. Now we got questions.
I got one. So if you had known the consequences, I think you said I would have done it anyway, but you said I didn't realize my staff wouldn't really be behind me and I would be standing alone. Can you
That was
think back-
naive on my part, by the way.
No, I know, but do you really think you would have stood up in any case? And I mean, if you had really known that you were really going to be all by yourself on this.
Yeah, and I think the reason why is that I was seeing no difference between my own aspirations in career and life and the organization. Now, if it weren't that way, then that's a different matter. And in fact, there is a book I would recommend to you all if you're interested in the whistleblowing concept. It's called Beautiful Souls, S-O-U-L-S, by E.L. Press. And what he does in the book is to show you research about people who blow whistles. And they are loyal people. And they're not necessarily flaming liberal Democrats, although they are whistleblowers too. Whistleblowers come from all walks of life, but the main kind of common denominator is that they are indeed loyal people and want to try to do the right thing. And so I wanted to try to do the right thing is why I'm trying to do it again. But I would try to get support, for heaven's sake. You know, I just assumed too much with respect to my staff. Oh, sure, they're going to be there. They had a job to lose themselves, and that was a fearful. And I didn't even think about that. I hate to be so naive, but that's the way it was then.
I, like you, is kind of self-reflection and self-awareness. I have noticed that there's this point where I've noticed something about myself or about someone else. And when it happens for myself, there's an opportunity to change it, but it doesn't necessarily happen. There's like chasm where I've noticed it, but I don't know how to integrate it into my life. I've been reading some of Robert Keegan's work on that, like transition between, oh, this is happening, to, oh, how do I actually act differently? So I wonder if you have any thoughts or insight on crossing that boundary.
Well, let me just build on Keegan's work for a moment, because that's good work. I really value it. And it's related to William Bridges' work about transitions. And so when we think about transitions in life, Bridges tells us that we go through 3 phases, or 3 stages. And the first one is letting go. And the second one is the transition itself. And the third one is the new state that you're moving toward. And of course, the most troublesome area is that middle part, where you're in transition. And that's why I was saying earlier that I felt like I was in the desert for 2 years. And things were not happening the way I thought they would and we could, and so on and so forth, to build on their point. However, looking back now and examining Bridges' work more carefully, I think that what causes us to have the problem that you're talking about is we have not let go of the past. Until you let go of that, you're not free enough to experiment, to take chances, to do things you might not otherwise do, and so forth. So, why is divorce such a hard thing to go through? Because you have to let go if you're going to do it. And I mean really let go. Otherwise, you're going to be holding on to something that's ridiculous. So, if you find yourself not being able to move on, you have not let go.
Bradford, did you have anything to add to that?
No, the only thing I was thinking about for myself is if it's an important thing, it comes up over and over and over again. So even if you miss that first opportunity, you're gonna see it soon.
Over here.
This question is for Mr. Manning. My question is what techniques do you generally use to invite people into what might be perceived as an adverse situation? Because sometimes people need a bridge. So for example, our ADA coordinator happens to be blind. I teach at a college. And people are very awkward about what to do or say. I said, Volunteers Day is coming. Why don't you pick up a phone and say you want to plant some flowers and we're all going to lunch? Oh, I didn't think of that. And so, I guess I'm asking, how can people best embrace what might be another person's adversity, but really is a growth opportunity for themselves?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and a lot of people have different opinions on it. The way my brother and I, my personal opinion on it, you find yourself in a lot of awkward situations where somebody asking questions they're just sort of missing the mark, and could they be interpreted as offensive. I always try to start from the place. This is sort of the opposite of the question you're asking, but I always try to start from the place of the intentions are good, right? Yeah. If you're in an ambiguous situation or you don't have a familiarity, and it's not just vision impairment. I'm sure we can all think of our own sort of diverse backgrounds that if somebody says something and you're like, this person really has no clue what they're talking about. But I don't think a lot of that is malicious, So I try to start from the point like let them ask the awkward questions, put a smile on, and we'll answer it. And then once we know each other better, then it gets real, and then you actually have a real relationship with that person. So to invite people in, I've also approached it from a place of like a lot of personal agency, where if all my friends are going out and they were playing baseball and I couldn't play, I'd try to find a way to include myself, or in another activity, or I feel like that I always took a lot of that responsibility on myself. If you're in a situation, and if you're in a situation where you're facing somebody who you think is going through their own adversity, I mean, the truth is people appreciate an effort. Even if you stumble through the beginning, if somebody wants to talk to me about a vision impairment or ask me an awkward question, I mean, I don't blame them for it, and I know that we'll get to a real place, and it's where the intention is. If the intention is to be inclusive and to do good, that's always going to come through in the end, I think.
However, things do not go, you do not transfer out to another person to 100% your intentions. How many times has the person found something about what you said to be not quite what we were talking about? So the point I'm trying to make is we are never perfect about intentions. It's not that easy. So we can talk about our intentions being good, but it doesn't come across necessarily that way to the other person. So when you are in an adverse situation and it's conflict, the main thing you want to do is to get feedback on whether or not what you said is what you meant.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do that, it's just going to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Because our intentions, let me repeat myself, our intentions are not perfect. I cannot read you perfectly. I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to be able to do that. I can't. And I'll have to say, would you just tell me that again? I don't think I understood what you meant. And I don't have any trouble doing that, because if I really want to know what the person's saying, I don't have any problem asking him to repeat it. And I don't have, and people don't seem to have any problem repeating it if we're, in a quality kind of exchange. But what you intend is never perfect. Please remember.
Hi. I'd love to hear from the whole panel about what your ideas would be about dealing with tactics for fear. Because I feel like a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of what's being brought up about choice points, about transitions, about awkwardness, right, in certain situations in which our perceptions may be different, that it comes down to this kind of crossroads of fear and how we deal with our own fear. So just curious about we've talked about self-reflection, we've talked about kind of separating the challenge from self-identity. Just curious what other tactics that you have experienced in regards to that element, as it's pretty powerful, with dealing with fear.
Tough one.
Tough one. I'm afraid of it.
That's a great question, and obviously there's no magic bullet for doing the things that we're afraid of, and fear is healthy in a lot of circumstances because it protects you.
Absolutely.
The way, one of the things that I think is interesting is being aware of it is a big part of it, right? And especially there are so many things in our life where fear is really the only thing holding us back. You see that cute person at the bar you want to go talk to. The worst, the only reason you're not is because you're afraid of the social pressure, But there are things that are more meaningful, and I think that you kind of have to cultivate a spirit. If dealing with fear is maybe like a skill, and you have to sort of cultivate that muscle. That's what comes to mind for me.
I agree, Bradford. And again, it's a matter of learning how to take little steps. So number one, try to understand yourself in terms of what are the emotional reactions that you immediately have when you're afraid. Where does it come from? I mean, where is it in your body? Sweaty palms is probably a good place to look, first of all. Heart palpitations is another one. Your pulse rate's going to go up and so forth. So notice those kinds of signs, because we're in a fearful situation before we cognitively realize it. And it's our emotions that tell us, first of all, whether or not we're afraid. Not the cerebrum. I act like I'm a brain expert, but this little bit of, I know what the hell I'm talking about. So, because what happens is that under fear is the limbic system is what is encountered first. And that's the seat of emotions. And so the problem is that we allow our emotions to overcome us. And we can't take the little experimental step that would not be, a terrible thing, and we might get into a little bit of trouble, but not a lot, because we're so overwhelmed with the emotion. So it's being able to pinpoint where it is we experience that fear in our body, first of all, and to recognize it sooner than we usually do, and not get overcome by the emotion. Because one of the problems with anger is we get overcome by it. And the same thing can happen with respect to fear. I realize that's not very helpful, but it's the only thing I know how to respond, is being so aware of where it starts with you and getting on top of it sooner than you otherwise might. Because the sooner you do, the more you can act in a reasonably rational manner rather than going off the wall. Easy for me to say.
Can you talk a little bit about the link between adversity and leadership effectiveness? Because I'm wondering whether one's ability to bounce back from major adversity predict one's degree of being an effective leader.
Yeah, that's a good question. I suspect so, but I don't know of really any research about that. It would be a good area of research, I think, is do people who deal with adversity better than most become more effective leaders? That's your hypothesis of your research question. And it's a very good one. Yeah. Now, we can pick out examples like that, but is there some sort of commonality to it? And I don't know the answer to that. My guess is there is, but I don't really know. But it's a very good question. I'd like to know. So I'll get one of my doctoral students on this right away.
Well, you know what comes up for me when I think about that? What's the link between adversity and effective leadership? I think one of the big keys is if you have somebody who's faced a lot of adversity, can they teach that to the people in their organization? Because if you're running an organization or a business or a project or whatever it is, and there are challenges involved with it, can you, if you are that leader who has faced a lot of adversity, can you help guide your organization with those skills? I mean, that takes a piece, which is, can you communicate those things that that you've lived through?
Well, that also makes me think of what Google did, their Aristotle study. Remember we talked about that? And what Google did, folks, is maybe many of you know, but they spent upwards of 2 to 3 years trying to figure out what made the teams that were effective, what made them effective, what made good teamwork. And they wanted to know what the common denominator was about it. And it took them a long time to find that out for themselves. It turned out to be psychological safety. That is, if a person in the group felt like they could say what they meant and not pay a price for that, that contributed to effective teamwork. And that now is pretty much the gospel. However, recent doctoral students done her study on learning agility and psychological safety and found that in an engineering firm, there was no relationship, which says context is extremely important. It says that the type of profession you're working with is very important to understand. In other words, here's what I've learned from that. Engineers don't necessarily even think of the concept of psychological safety. It doesn't occur to them. Safety has to do with whether or not that bridge is going to stay up or not, and things like that. That's the way they think about safety. You can't take Google's work and generalize to the whole damn work, is what I'm trying to say. But is it important? It certainly is. Where the people are more concerned about interactions among themselves. Engineers don't particularly care about interpersonal relationships. I don't know if you know that, but they don't. It's not important. What's important is getting the right answer, and they can. We in psychology have no idea what the right answer is, because the key words in psychology are, it depends. So, know your audience, know the people you're working with. And in fact, I spent a long time working with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I could not understand why engineers and scientists couldn't talk to one another, like ships passing in the night. They just didn't think alike. So the profession you choose is a reflection of how you think. And scientists are intuitive. Engineers are grounded in not thinking about the blue sky, thinking about whether this number matches that number. So forth. So they're sensing, and you MBTI people, the difference between intuition and sensing.
Are you talking about mechanical engineers?
Yeah, they're all different kinds of engineers.
Actually, this particular firm is a broad spectrum of engineers, not just mechanical. There's some civil, but it's mostly more like high-tech stuff.
I was in a software engineering program and I did an MBTI survey, as did a friend of mine, and in my sample of 100, it was 95% intuitive, and her sample of 500, it was like 75%, so it's interesting that you said that.
No wonder you're no longer doing that.
Okay, so you have a question?
Me?
Yep.
Okay. I'd like to share an observation, if I might, in terms of whether adversity is generally a positive or a negative occurrence in an individual's path. It's completely dependent upon the individual. Some people will be very intimidated and shy away from an adversity, and many others need the adversity to mobilize themselves to move forward. So there isn't any generalization that you can make about, a wonderful opportunity can be blown by somebody who doesn't have the wherewithal to take advantage of it. So this is really more individual. And if you can work with individuals to have them build the confidence in their own intuitive and insightfulness, they will then be able to turn more adversities, I believe, into positive occurrences in their life.
Good point.
And one thing I think is so interesting about that is that's a luxury of the world we live in, because 1,000 years ago they wouldn't be debating about whether or not you should have more or less adversity. They'd say, I want things easier, And I think we live in a time where there is so much comfort and convenience. I think it's interesting to see, the role that adversity plays, and does adversity get more and more valuable when there's becoming less abundance of it. I think it's just really fascinating.
I'm thinking of myself in two realms in terms of my experience with teams and when it was to say making mistakes or trial and error, or facing situations where you want to give your teams the ability to have the psychological safety to make the mistakes. And I guess one hat I'm wearing is as a consultant, the other is as a business owner. And as a business owner, I think that there is tolerance for mistakes up until a point, and then there becomes the sense that when someone is not taking in the feedback that they receive from the environment about that mistake, that you become less tolerant. So I think that there are, as a business owner, I think there are times in which, when a mistake, the person is making the same mistake over and over and over again, where it becomes, unworkable. And yet on the same plane, you do want to encourage your employees to have ownership, to try things, but you also want them to recognize what works and what doesn't over time. So I would say that it's I guess, there's sort of the blue sky of it, and then there's the side of it that is about, learning from mistakes. So I think that there's a difference between those that learn from their mistakes and those that don't.
Oh, you bet there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't emphasize the importance, though, of the point you're making is that tolerance of mistakes is really important to breed. Up to a point, obviously. You can have a limit on that. But if people don't feel like they can make mistakes, things are not going to be innovative. So the gain you get from mistake making is innovation. provided you don't allow it to go crazy. So, yes.
When you were talking about engineering, I remembered something from my PhD research here at Teachers College. I studied the history of education in engineering and how it used to be holistic and artistic and led to Renaissance. But later on, in exactly 1737, Napoleon started the first school of engineering, which was only math and science focused, more math and tech, and no philosophies or humanities or arts, because he wanted them to design and invent more craft. And from there on, engineering is separated from other
Engineering separated from what?
from other fields, mainly arts and humanities. But then that scientific mindset
I
that
understand.
scientists apply in research is not very much applied to engineering, because all we need to do is calculate, analyze, design, and think of how they can improve technical objects. So what you were saying is exactly true about the climate of engineering. And the students inherit that from their professors or previous educators, and also engineering in the US entered academia much later than other fields like science. Science was forever an academic field.
Right.
Engineering is, it was in 19th century that engineering became an academic field. And then they thought of adding writing, I think English, which is my field, English education, to their education, and now we're thinking of making engineering more interdisciplinary and connected more to arts and humanities. So I'm not surprised. They used to learn engineering through apprenticeship, not through academic education like in medical fields or scientific.
As you were talking, I was thinking of the book I've just finished reading, Leonardo da Vinci, Walter Isaacson's book. And if there ever was an engineer in the broad sense of the way you're describing it, it was Da Vinci. Incredible, I must say. I think, and oh, by the way, Leonardo da Vinci would probably, on my learning agility questionnaire, knock the top out of it. He'd be off the scale. What an agile learner he was. Such an impressive. By the way, as you, just a piece of understanding about the aging process, which I represent. The older you get, the more you're going to want to read about history.
Yeah.
More adaptive.
I hope so. Yeah. So I'm reading all kinds of books on history, but about people, leaders for the most part. Yeah. So that's going to happen to you. So just welcome it, let it wash over you.
Just a perfect segue to talk about the aging, because I'm also on the back line, so I think I could speak from that perspective. Whether it's learning from contending with adversity or failure, being able to how one responds to adversity and failure at different stages of life is going to be determinant in some ways. So I mean, when I think I was listening to an interview that Adam Gopnik was doing on Being, and he talked about the division, that those who are still, quote, growing, and then those from whom the frontier of youth is starting to recede, and they go from growing to aging. But my question is, what would be the, aside from reading history, what are the learning, are there still growing and learning opportunities for those of us who have moved from growing to aging?
Well, of course, absolutely, there is. And the quickest way to death is to stop learning. And you know, I don't care how old you are, what your age is, if you're not in love with learning, you're going to die sooner than you otherwise probably would. I don't know that for a fact, I don't have any research on it, but what the hell, it sounds pretty interesting. ideas come from these kind of crazy thoughts. But the joy of learning is what keeps people alive, it seems to me.
But is the learning itself, I mean, getting into the habit of continuing to learn, something that gives one added reserves of strength to cope with failure and adversity at later stages of life?
I would think that's a worthy hypothesis. Yeah. And you know, Da Vinci, what was key to him? Isaacson makes the point time and time again in the book. Da Vinci was probably the most curious person who's ever lived. He was curious about everything. And certainly nowhere near what I don't reach that amount of curiosity at all. You know, of course, you know, why is the sky blue? Well, yeah, a lot of people, know things like that. But, you know, why does certain plants grow in the way they do? He was interested in that. I don't have it. Never mind. But he was curious about everything. So the more curiosity there. I mean, by the way, he did live a long life. So that's another way of kind of thinking about learning, lifelong learning, is being curious about things. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the loneliness of adversity, I'm wondering if you have a friend or family member who is going through adversity, how much impact can a friend or a family member have on easing somebody else's adversity versus the person just having to go through those stages you talked about?
Well, I do have a good friend whose wife is going through hell. And it really, really is important for him to have support himself, not to mention the support, because he's giving every ounce of support he can to his wife. So, but nobody's providing support for him. And that's what is important to me, is to provide, you know, that kind of support for him, because he's going to run out of gas in terms of trying to help her deal with the adversity she's facing, which is enormous. I'm talking about cancer, of course. What else would I be talking about? It's just the scourge of our being these days is cancer. So anyway, does that respond to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I get. You know what I'm trying to piece together. You're saying that find a trusted friend to talk to when
Right.
you're going through adversity, compared with needing to let go in order to keep going. Like, how much of a factor is the friend being supportive in a person being able to let go?
It is a major factor.
Okay.
It's a major factor. And when death comes, in this particular instance I'm talking about, it's going to be extremely difficult. Because I can see now letting go is going to be a huge, huge issue. And there's no fault of him, you know, no fault. I mean, it's just the way it is. But that's why I think it's so important to provide him with support, I believe, would be helpful.
Can you say sorry to follow up, can you do a couple of tactical ways of being supportive with these giant adversities? Real tactics.
It's time for us to have a martini together.
Well.
I'm not kidding.
Besides alcohol.
What's wrong with that?
Bradford, do you have something else to add?
All I can say is I think I'm 5 years older than my younger brother who has the same eye condition, and so we had each other, and you know, I have a feeling that did tremendous things for us. We have we hear from families now or people who see our story online or whatever, and will say, "Oh, I live 45 minutes north of Albuquerque, and I didn't know that anybody else in the country had this situation," or whatever. And you know, we just reflect on how lucky we were to have each other, because it gave you this. First of all, it made everything feel normal because here's the closest person to you dealing with the same stuff. So it relativized everything, and we could hold each other accountable and be competitive and do all those brotherly things while at the same time having each other and having this condition. I don't have any good advice for a specific, consulting somebody who's going through a major adversity. All I know is that having somebody to relate to and talk to, like I had my younger brother, was very valuable to me.
Thank you.
Great. Take one more question.
Similar to what you just said, I actually am in a situation where I'm trying to encourage other parents to face their adversity. I have a child with a rare disease, probably a similar situation to what your parents went through. And I'm trying to work to build an online community for these children and their caregivers, as well as the physician's component. It's very difficult because there's a huge amount of denial, especially early on. And so I'm trying to create this community, but at the same time, it's surrounded by adversity that so many don't or struggling to face. So, do you have any advice for me?
Well, I do have advice on that because I feel like we've learned some really interesting things about starting, this brand. I think one of the really, really important things is you got to communicate the mission in a super compelling and uplifting way because you want to attract and inspire people. I think one of the reasons we didn't do this proactively, but I think we've just benefited from a lot of people, not just people with vision impairment, like our brand, but those are our closest supporters. And I think they see that Brian and I are normal people having fun and doing what we do, and it draws them in to look further, So if I was doing anything for another project for people with adversity, I would show them that because you will serve as an example. And I think and this is just very tactical, I would make a video because it's what helped us tremendously, a 1 to 5 minute video on a very personal story, but an uplifting one. And that served as a great piece of marketing for us. So that was our recipe.
Good advice.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone, this engaging audience, and our amazing panelists for their time. If we walk away with anything, we all know that we can now find fruit in failure, and I hope that we all take a nice big bite out of that going forward. So enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy Academic Festival.